Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. My name is Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl. Doesn't this look better? I love being back in the studio with you guys this week and recording this at my desk where I know where all my equipment is. I'm feeling much better. Thank you for the messages of support. This week we're talking about one of the most popular aspects of Renaissance England culture, and that is the idea that they drank exorbitant amounts of beer. And they did, because the water and sanitation in England during this time was really bad. So this week we're asking the question, did Shakespeare drink beer? Yes, Shakespeare did drink beer. We can say this with a good amount of certainty, strictly because it was so popular. And there are records of Shakespeare meeting up with some of his friends, like Ben Jonson, at ale houses and inns where beer would have been served. In fact, there's one inn in London called the Bell Inn, which claims to be the place where Ben Jonson and Shakespeare were hanging out when Shakespeare drank way too much and basically gave himself pneumonia from being drunk. And that's supposedly how Shakespeare died. Now, that's not a very glamorous way to go out, but it does show that drinking beer in Elizabethan England was popular and it was something associated with Shakespeare's life. There's even a story of Shakespeare and Ben Jonson meeting up at the Bell Inn. Now, the Bell Inn makes the claim that they are the place where Ben Jonson and Shakespeare had their famous last go. Shakespeare supposedly drank too much alcohol, got drunk, and either got pneumonia from drinking the alcohol or caught pneumonia because he was too drunk to take care of himself. But either way, that's supposedly what killed him, was a night of too much fun drinking beer. Now, that's not a glamorous way to go out, but it is indicative of the culture of the day, which was consuming lots of beer, and Shakespeare himself did most likely drink beer. According to the official census in England, there were a little less than 20,000 retail alcohol outlets. That is almost 6 times the number of retail alcohol outlets that there are today. So there were a lot more. There were, interestingly, attacks on intoxication, and with the attacks on intoxication, ale houses increased. So legislation doesn't necessarily prevent what you don't like, apparently. But the first beer that was brewed in the Americas actually came from this time period. We've talked about how Sir Walter Raleigh was doing a lot of exploration for Queen Elizabeth during this time. And one of the things that he explored was the colony in Virginia. And they actually brewed the first beer in the New World there. And they did that because they were using the corn or the maize there to brew this beverage that was popular in England at the time. To show you how much beer was actually being drank, we can look at the rations of English soldiers. They were rationed a daily portion of a gallon of beer per person. And so we would assume that the military, when they are rationing, which would be less than what you might consume if you had free reign over what you could consume, that the average person actually was drinking more than that. So it's a considerable amount of beer being consumed. There are some reports that say the beer was perhaps not the same alcohol content as what beer is brewed in today. So it's possible that they weren't really walking around highly intoxicated all the time, but I do think they were definitely walking around more intoxicated than not drinking that much beer. What's really funny to me when looking up the history of beer in Elizabethan England is that there was this dichotomy of culture. Like, on the one hand, you had people inventing new ways to make beer. There was an Alexander Noel who showed that ale stored in corked, sealed glass bottles would last longer. So they started storing beer this way. So there was an obvious popular demand for beer and good beer and for it to last a long time because people wanted to enjoy it. But at the same time, in 1606, the English Parliament is passing laws against the quote, odious and loathsome sin of drunkenness. So it's interesting to me that people were consuming large amounts of beer and at the same time passing laws against drunkenness. It was an interesting time to live in. So why were they drinking this much beer? Well, in Elizabethan England, plumbing was not so great. Inside the city walls, houses were stacked really close together, and they were stacked up high. When they ran out of ground level, then, you build up. And so houses would often be up to 3 stories high. And each of these levels, when they had to go to the restroom, they would pour out their refuse into the street. And there were actually ditches along the sides of the roads into which the refuse was supposed to be poured. And there was water running through this ditches from the rainwater and runoff and other sources, and it's designed to wash it all away, theoretically. But where it washed it all away to was the River Thames. And the Thames River was everyone's basically source of water. People would wash their clothes here and get water for bathing here. Actually, one German traveler to London during this time period wrote home about how Londoners would wash their clothes in the Thames River, and it smelled so bad that the people of London walk around stinking, that their clothes actually contained an odor from having washed their clothes in the Thames River. So obviously, washing it in the river didn't get it very clean. The river was forming a source of water for a large portion of the city, but the river was polluted and there was no good filtration system to filter out the impurities. And so there was a lack of good drinking water and a lack of good overall sanitation because their primary water source was contaminated. Now, I thought that there was no indoor plumbing available in London during this time period. I had thought that that was something that didn't exist. What I found when researching this episode is that there was public latrines were available and there was indoor plumbing. The problem was that they had a primitive conduit system, and so it was only available to really wealthy residents. Now, a few wealthy residents, and I was able to find it was up to 400 people, around 400 people in London were wealthy enough to have clean running water piped into their residence. But it was illegal to tap into that pipe if you weren't paying for it. Now, we're used to that because we pay for water now through the public waterworks system. They tried to get a public waterworks system up and going in London during the 16th and 17th century, but it never really took off. Most of the people in London and the people in charge politically didn't want to go to the expense of introducing a waterworks system or indoor plumbing in a wide way. So this was really sort of a luxury item that a few people who had the money to pay to have it could pay to have, but it was kind of a novelty. You were considered someone that was, just exorbitant to prefer that you have your water piped into your house. So it was there, but it wasn't what most people did. There was a man named Sir Hugh Middleton, and he built what was called the New River. It was an audacious and impressive pure water system for London. And it would be years after Shakespeare's death before the system was widely used, but it was created during Shakespeare's lifetime. There was a constable in 1579 that determined 57 households on Tower Street in London, which was about 85 people living there, had only 3 privies. And there was supposed to be a common latrine provided per certain group of tenants. And what they found when they went in and investigated this is that introducing a common latrine and keeping one up and keeping it clean was expensive and troublesome. And so a lot of times the landowner would just not provide one. And so what happens then is they don't have a proper place to put their bathroom goings, and so they would just pour it into the street, which created such a nasty place to walk that you can research shoes from this time period, and there are actually shoes that were designed to elevate you up off of the ground. So it was like the sole of the shoe has this metal stand on it that raises the walker up above the refuse, so you can walk down the street and not actually walk in the disgustingness waste that got thrown into the street. Now, what's really nasty to me is that the Thames River was actually a source of cooking and culinary water for residents in London. To me, that's just no surprise that there were so many outbreaks of plague because their water system was just so nasty. It was contaminated with piles of poop and anything that washed off of ships and any inflow from streams or urban runoff. All of this ended up in the Thames River and made it just really filthy. And it was this haven for rats. And the rats carried the plague bacteria, which is why London broke out so much in the plague. You might be thinking, well, why did people just not forego water altogether? Well, because we're human beings and we're like 90-something% water. I think it's as much as 98% water. You have to drink water to live. And even in the 16th and 17th century, when they didn't have so much figured out medicinally, they knew that you had to drink at least a little bit of water. So when you look at records from doctors and physicians from this time period, it's also another source of humor, because the doctors will acknowledge that you have to drink water to live and then kind of encourage you to avoid it as much as you can, because the water that was available to people in London was so freakishly gross. I'm going to quote you. There is a writer, Hildegard of Bingen, was writing in the middle of the 12th century. Now, this was before Shakespeare, but the quote is awesome. It says, "Whether one is healthy or infirm, if one is thirsty after sleeping, one should drink wine or beer, but not water, for water might damage rather than help one's blood and humors." And so there was this thought process that was the old school of thought coming into life, that water was dangerous. Now later in 1542, which was 20 years before Shakespeare was born, another doctor writes about water not being wholesome by itself. It slows the digestion, and the best water is rainwater. And that was probably because you can't drink it out of the river. And so, and he goes on to write out a method for distilling the water. He says the water should be clean and purely taken. The second best thing after rainwater in this book, they recommend running water that does run east into the west upon stones or pebbles. Now, if you know anything about distilling water or filtering water, the stones and pebbles would have filtered out some of the trash. And so he is basically recommending that you filter the water before you drink it. And so that's another reason that people were drinking beer more than anything else, because there was this culture of thought that water is dangerous. When you can't drink the water and you're drinking a lot of beer, this leads to alcohol abuse. And it was so widespread that Elizabeth herself personally intervened by issuing a ban on a drink called double double beer. And it was basically a high alcohol content beer. And she banned it because they were drinking it so much that they ended up getting drunk. And when I say so much, her courtiers would drink up to 600,000 gallons in 1593 alone. So lots of beer. It's estimated that the average person, including William Shakespeare, would have drank around 17 pints of beer each week. And again, the main preference for beer being not because they were just a bunch of drunkards, but because they were afraid to drink the water. It carried disease, and they knew that if you drink the water, you get sick. So they picked something else, and the only other reasonable alternative was beer. As a result, the English in general got a renowned reputation for being able to drink vast amounts of beer. And this wide alcohol industry created careers which are now obsolete, one of which was held by William Shakespeare's father. The job of an ale conner. It was a position that John Shakespeare held when he lived in Stratford. The ale conner's job was to test the quality of the beer. And the way that they tested it was pouring it over a bench and then sitting on it while wearing leather trousers. If the trousers stuck, the beer was made badly. And there are some popular lore and legends surrounding William Shakespeare himself and his ability to drink beer. According to some stories, and this is just a fun story, don't take this part as fact, but he apparently once took part in a drinking contest where he fell asleep under an apple tree. If you go to Stratford upon Avon today, there is an inn located where this supposed apple tree was, where Shakespeare fell asleep after drinking so much beer. So if you're into legends and you want to play around with that one, you can go and see that. Now, like everything else in Elizabethan England, everything was divided up by class. Taverns were the upmarket establishment where the middle class would enjoy bottles of wine, while the poorer people were confined to cheaper ale houses or inns, which were similar to modern hotels. This makes sense as to why players like William Shakespeare would perform their plays at inns and in the inn yards, because their target audience would be going to these ale houses and inns to drink beer. And so when you perform the play there, you can charge the patrons a little extra to see the performance. They're already there anyway, so they stay. Among the oldest pubs in London, there are several that claim to have ties to William Shakespeare himself. The one that I think has the most likely claim to William Shakespeare is the George Inn. Now, it burned down and was rebuilt in 1677, but it was the one that was most likely to have been visited by William Shakespeare. It's an example of an Elizabethan inn yard where performances were held. Now, inn yards were a precursor to modern playhouses, and some inn yards were even later converted into playhouses because they were so popular for this purpose. That's why I think the George Inn, if you want to go to Stratford or London and you want to visit places that Shakespeare might have visited himself, the George Inn is a place that you should check out. Now, as I mentioned, the actual building there is not the one that Shakespeare would have visited, because the one he visited burned down in 1677 and it had to be rebuilt. So the actual, you're not walking on the wood boards that Shakespeare walked on, but you are in a place that he would have been, and you're getting to see some of the things that he would have seen, and certainly taking a look at the play yard and the place where how that was set up there for performances are worth the visit. That's it for this week here at Did Shakespeare. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned something new about the Bard. If you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe. Every like and subscribe that this video gets helps this information reach more people. And as you know, as Shakespeareans, we love our friends. So hit the subscribe button and become our friend, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.